In Think 101, we are thinking about thinking. That is, we're thinking about reasoning, about judgment, about the choices we make, decision making. How do we make choices? How do we think about things like expertise? How do we turn somebody who knows nothing into somebody who knows a lot?
So what I think we're trying to do is bring that kind of scientific thinking, that rigor, that way of approaching problems, of finding things out of the lab and into our everyday lives.
It's never been more important to know how to learn, but it's not easy, and that's an ultimate sort of survival skill.
You can plant entirely false memories, whole memories, into the minds of people for things that didn't happen. All that intelligence, all that experience, all that education doesn't protect you.
I think part of being skeptical is keeping an open mind, but demanding evidence. Try and find some evidence first, and then make up your mind.
We wanted people to confront things that they think about and do every day and realize that there's science around them, every place.
The best way to think about, will I be able to do something well in the future, is to simulate it in the present.
I would say to both skeptics and believers, try and base your thoughts and your beliefs on the evidence. I mean, that's what you do in many different areas of your life.
The world doesn't really look the way you think it looks. There's not a simple panacea here.
I personally find that the smartest people I meet are always willing to say they don't know something.
Science isn't just for scientists, it's for anybody with integrity that really honestly wants to understand their world.
Making mistakes is really important. If it feels easy, you're probably doing it wrong.
People will quickly recognize that the letter string at the bottom will produce more words than the letter string at the top.
Why would the order of the stockings affect my judgment?
Oh, that was disgusting. Oh, what was that nice one? What was the really good one?
That's what I'm gonna do. I'm totally gonna
1 minute.
take a sip. And
Sorry, what were you saying?
hang on, let me enjoy.
You totally should. So one of the things we're trying to do in this course is give a realistic idea about how the mind is actually working.
Think clearly, think effectively. Ultimately, we want them to have the tools to be able to change the world. Okay, here's what I want you to do. Imagine that you're sitting in front of an auditorium and you're asked to perform for a room full of people by tapping out a tune for everyone to hear. The tune should be something that you think everyone would know. A few examples that most people would know from North America, Australia, or the UK might be Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Baba Black Sheep. Or Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head. Now imagine that you're standing in Matt's position and that there's 100 people watching you perform in front of this auditorium. I want you to estimate how many of the 100 listeners would be able to name the tune that you're tapping. Okay? So go to the next section and enter a number between 0 and 100. So, how well do you think you went?
I think I did reasonably well. There are a couple of notes that I may have missed, but overall my performance was pretty good, I think.
All right, well, let's see whether the people at home can actually guess what it was that you were tapping out.
How well did I do?
Well, if you're like most people who's done this experiment, this has been done a lot of times. In fact, it's based on a board game. People actually try to hum or they tap a particular song, and other people in the room try to guess what it was. And if you've done one of these games, it's really difficult. And in fact, people who guess, an audience of about 100 people who guess, find that about 2.5% of people guess correctly. So that's pretty bad. And you remember we went and talked to Lee Ross at Stanford University. Now he was the supervisor of this woman's project who actually did this experiment formally, named Elizabeth Newton, in the 1980s. And she found exactly that. I think people guessed about 50% of people in the auditorium would guess correctly, right? When in fact, only about 2.5% of the people in the auditorium guessed correctly. So here's what Lee had to say about her project. You had a student in, I think, 1990, Elizabeth Newton, right, who did a tapping experiment. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I must say, the real author of that study was my brother, who was a musician.
Really?
And he used to do this when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And he showed me this interesting phenomena, that if you tap out a tune, you think you know for sure what it is. It seems really obvious to you. And in part, that's because when you're tapping the tune, you hear the music that accompanies it, and you know when you're not tapping whether that's a musical rest or a sustained note. This is something you only can appreciate by trying it, but I would urge anyone seeing the series to try it on someone. Tap some really familiar song, you know. You can tap the national anthem, or you can tap Jingle Bells, or something really familiar. And to you, it'll seem absolutely inevitable that the other person will know, and they'll look at you with a kind of blank look. So when Elizabeth Newton came along, I had described this phenomenon to her, and she said, "Oh, that's great, let's make a study of it," and it became part of her dissertation.
Now, the idea is that when you're listening to these songs as an audience member, to the person who's tapping, and you know what it is that you're looking for, it's extremely vivid from the inside, right? Because you're kind of following along, you're listening to the music. But if you're not familiar with the music, it's just tapping. And so it's really difficult from somebody kind of standing in the shoes of an audience member to guess what it is that you're tapping. But for you, it seems so obvious, right? Like, how could you not guess green sleeves in this particular case? It's obvious, right? Right? But from the audience's perspective, it's not obvious, right? They're just hearing, you know, songs or tapping on their hand, and they can't interpret what it is that's being portrayed. Part of the reason, as Lee said in the interview, is that you can't tell whether, you know, a delayed note, whether it's sustained because it's a note that's carrying on, or whether, you know, you're holding it because it's a break in the music. You can only tell that from the inside, right? You can't tell it from objectively, from kind of the audience member's perspective. Now, this is going to be an example that we're going to return to again and again in the course, and the idea is that it's really difficult to put yourself in the shoes or see things from the perspective of other people. And that's going to be something we're going to work on again and again throughout the entire course. And I think this is a really nice example of that.
I've got a great example of this. It's a song by Regurgitator. I've been using this example for years. And what I get people to do is I just play the song from the start without saying anything. And I say, there's an electronic voice here and it's actually saying English words. And I want you to tell me what the lyrics of this song are.
I like your old stuff better than your new stuff. I like your
play it through and people say, oh, I think I got this word, or I think he said salmon or people, or lots of things come through. And then I say, okay, let's play it again. And this time, as the song is playing, I show the lyrics on the screen as the song is playing. The reaction is incredible. All of a sudden, people can hear vividly exactly what these words are and what the electronic voice is, like it was there all along. And people sometimes think that I'm playing a trick on them, that I played 2 tracks, but no. When you know what the lyrics are, the words just sound crystal clear.
There's another really good example of this, where people find hidden messages in songs. So you can either play a song forward or you can play it backward. And when you're listening to it, you can hear messages that may not have been there intentionally on behalf of the band. And so people have some pretty creative sort of interpretations of what the actual backward or forward messages say.
I spoke to John Vokey about exactly this. He was involved in a legal case, actually, with a band called Judas Priest, and he has an incredible story about his involvement in that case and what happened. You have to hear it. It's fantastic. You were involved in the early 80s in quite a bit of controversy with the band Judas Priest. And the claim, I think, was that they had backwards messages in their rock music that led to some unfortunate outcomes. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
2 young men, 2 days before Christmas, were sitting in their basement of one of their houses, drinking beer, smoking marijuana, and listening to Judas Priest. And all afternoon. And then at the end of the afternoon, they picked up a shotgun, walked to a local church playground that had swings and teeter-totters and that kind of thing, proceeded to sit down on the swings or a bench, I can't remember the details now, and attempted to commit suicide. One of them succeeded. The other just blew his face off, but managed to survive. In the hospital, immediately after, when the police asked him, why did you do this? The response of the survivor was, life sucks, which is not an uncommon response among teenagers, as they were. But the parents then, a few years later, actually decided to sue. But they didn't decide to sue the gun manufacturer. They didn't decide to sue the brewery that provided the beer, or the place that sold it. They didn't decide to go after the drug dealers who had sold them the marijuana. No, they decided to go after Judas Priest and CBS Records. I received a phone call from the head lawyer for Judas Priest and CBS Records. It was actually a whole firm of lawyers in Reno, California, which is where the trial was going to take place. It's about a year before the trial. I received this phone call because of the work I'd done on backward messages in rock music with Don Reed, a colleague of mine then at the University of Lethbridge, that we'd done in response to this pastor from California coming to town and holding these big rallies about backward messages in rock music that were leading young people down the path of licentious sex and drug use. And he claimed it was because of the backward messages in the rock music. It led to a big rally at the end of his 2 days there, where people showed up and broke records and things like this. It was quite the celebrity in Lethbridge. I was a brand new professor in 1982. I just arrived in Lethbridge. And so I got a phone call back then from a local announcer of a rock station in Lethbridge, calling me up after Pastor Gary Greenwald had arrived, saying, is there anything in psychology that we could use to speak about this alleged backward messages in rock music, or subliminal messages, they were calling them? And I turned to my colleague, Don Reed, and we both went, not that we're aware of. And we did a little research, but we couldn't find anything on backward messages. So I went to one of his, actually went more than one of his rallies to find out what he was doing. And on the basis of what he was doing, it seemed to be pretty clear that there really wasn't the effect that he thought it was going on, but rather just some standard psychological phenomena that we were well aware of, old phenomena in psychology. So it was on that basis then that Don Reed and I said, but to be fair, we should run some research, right? But this is a claim nobody's investigated. He was earnest. It wasn't like he was just a con man or something. He was actually earnest, as far as I know he still is. He actually believes this is true. And so we decided, well, fair enough. Right? Now his claim, and it's more subtle than most people think. So when it really hit the press in the mid-'80s, people had the wrong idea of what in fact he was claiming. So his concern is not that messages are being inserted in rock music, because obviously the forward messages in many rock songs, right, are promote drug use,
yes,
right, and the like. So that wasn't his concern. His concern was that, as he rephrased it at one of his meetings, I'm paraphrasing now, is that, well, good Christian teenagers with a forward message would hear it, understand it, and reject it.
Yeah.
But his concern was this, is much more subtle. And to be fair, I thought the guy deserves a shake, because he's not just thinking very glibly about this stuff. His concern was that because it was backwards, and it's hard to register consciously, if the message was still getting through, the meaning of the backward version of the message was getting through, then they would be unaware of the source. They wouldn't be able to attribute it to the record.
Yep.
But if the thought popped into their head by some unconscious mechanism, he never specified what that would be, but if it did, then they would have a message in their head with no attributable source except themselves.
Yep. And so they couldn't protect themselves against it.
Exactly. So they would now be looking at, thinking, it's fun to smoke marijuana, must be my idea. So what he would do is he would then come in, he'd say, okay, this is for example, Queen, Another One Bites the Dust, and he'd play a passage of Queen's Another One Bites the Dust in the forward direction.
Another one bites the dust. Another one bites the dust. And another one gone, and another one gone. Another one bites the dust.
And it sounded perfectly fine to you. Famous song. And then he said, here's the same section, I'm going to play it backwards, and I want you to listen for, and in this particular example, it's fun to smoke marijuana. And sure enough, everybody starts laughing, because everybody hears it. We use it as a classroom demonstration now. And it's quite apparent. It's quite apparent. Yes, it sounds like that, sort of, but it's like visual illusions. You're also aware at the same time that it isn't really like that, right? So it's got those two levels going on at the same time. But you could go, yeah, okay, I see what you mean, right? It does sound like it's fun to smoke marijuana. And he's many other examples like that. But that's his procedure. And he just comes in for about an hour, says, here's another passage I want you to listen for, then plays it. And by the time he's done, after about an hour, people are totally convinced. All these backward messages, I heard them all when he asked me to hear them. So we thought, okay, he's got a theory. He's got an explanation of why he's concerned, that if it did manage to get in without you being aware of the source, that in fact could be of some concern. So we thought, and there's no research, so why don't we actually see if you can influence people's behavior consistent with the meaning of the backward passage.
Okay, cool.
But they're not hearing the backward passage. That's the point. They're going to hear it in the forward direction.
So John Vokey and Don Reed wanted to find out exactly what people could do with backwards messages. So they did an experiment. They recorded a bunch of voices from different genders, so male and female. They recorded a bunch of voices of people from different countries, so different languages, so French, German, and English. They recorded people asking questions, and they also recorded people just saying declarations. And the question was, what can people do with these messages when they're played backwards? So what exactly does a backwards message sound like, and what can people pick up? So they found there were a couple of things that people could do with backwards messages and a couple of things that they couldn't do. The things that they could do with backwards messages was tell the difference between gender, whether it was a male or a female speaker talking. They could also tell the difference between different languages, so whether somebody was speaking German or English, and they could also, so when there was two males speaking backwards, they could tell the difference between speaker A and speaker B. There was also a couple of things that they couldn't do well. So you might be able to think, you may think that participants would tell the difference between a question and a declaration because a question sort of ends with an inflection, but they couldn't do that. They also couldn't tell the difference between a sentence that was with words in the correct order and a sentence where it was completely scrambled. But the most important thing they were trying to tap into with this experiment was sort of unconscious processing. Is there anything that people are able to pick up without their awareness? So they asked people to categorize these backwards sentences as either Christian or satanic or even pornographic. And they found that people could not correctly classify these things. So one of the sentences played forwards was, "Jesus loves me, this I know," and people couldn't correctly classify it as pornographic or Christian.
So what happened with the Judas Priest trial?
Well, I told you it was an awesome story, and now you've seen how John Vokey looks, you should see how it played out in court.
So that's the background. Published the paper in '85. Come the early '90s, and I get the phone call from the lawyers for Judas Priest in Reno, Nevada, where the trial is going to take place. This is a civil suit. The plaintiffs have filed for millions of dollars, by the way, in damages. And so she calls me up and says, "You're the only authorities on this. Nobody else has ever published a paper on backward messages." And they were claiming there were a number of backward subliminals in this particular album, the Stained Class album by Judas Priest. And I said, "Oh, okay, that's fine. I'm more than happy to serve as an expert for you. I'll provide you all the research I can get for you and other kinds of things." And she says, "Well, yeah, thank you very much. It's very nice, but no, we want you to come and testify for us." And I said, "Well, there's a problem." And she goes, "What problem?" I said, "You probably want my co-author to do this job. He's actually had experience in court as an expert witness, not in this domain, but in eyewitness testimony." And she said, no, you're the first author, we have to have you. And I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I only agree to do all this and come to the trial if you bring my colleague with me." And she said, "Yeah, fine, no big deal." And so a year, or almost a year. She calls me once, twice a week. We talk about things, how are things going, and so on. She says, "Okay, so you ready? You thinking about your testimony and this kind of stuff?" And well, as I said, I think you really want my colleague. So here's what happens. The day of, we're flying down there for the first weekend meeting, of actual face-to-face meeting. Now, the reason I was reticent, and I'd actually told her, is that I actually look like one of the band members. Shaggy, long, blonde hair. And the judge is known for having somewhat less than positive attitude toward people who look like me. And she said, "Oh, not a problem, don't worry about it." So the day we were to fly down to meet the team and Judas Priest, Don Reed was leaving from, I think it was Vancouver, and he got there earlier to Reno than I did from Lethbridge. So I'm the last to arrive. And it's about 5 in the afternoon. I go to the cabin, big law firm, and I go in there, and there's a big meeting room with these big old doors, open, very, very dramatic entry. And I come walking in, and there's this woman I've been talking to her for years. She's the head lawyer. All the other lawyers, there's Judas Priest around the table. There's Dawn sitting there. Like walking in, and she looks up at me, and she goes, "Oh my God." And then says, "Now, Dawn, when you're on the stand." So, I actually didn't testify at the Judas Priest trial.
Wow.
My name is John. I think about knowing.
So people have really fantastic pattern recognition abilities. And it's not just hearing messages that we expect to hear, but it's also visually as well. And there's a bunch of really good examples of this. Now, many people have seen this picture, but if you haven't, then it's not going to make much sense. They're just black patches on a white background. But what if I told you that the title of this picture is called Dalmatian Dog? Does that help? Well, if you still can't see it, then savor this moment, because once I show you, then you'll never be able to see this photo in the same way ever again. You ready? All right, here it is. Now, of course, you've seen many examples of this. People have reported seeing a face on Mars, or Elvis in the form of a tree, or even seeing the Virgin Mary in a toasted cheese sandwich. We tend to see faces all over the place. In fact, there's a nice website called Faces in Places, where people upload their own photographs of faces that they see in everyday objects, and it's filled with hundreds of great examples. People are really good at perceiving patterns. In fact, we're essentially pattern recognition machines, particularly for faces. So many times, our basic pattern recognition abilities are shaped by really specific expectations, like it's fun to smoke marijuana. And once you know what it is that you're listening for, automatically it kind of pops out, right? And again, I mean, this is found, for example, like in the Dalmatian dog. Once I tell you, for example, to look for the Dalmatian dog in the scene, all of the things that aren't consistent with the Dalmatian dog kind of just fade into the background, and all the things that are consistent with the Dalmatian dog really kind of pop out. And so it's this kind of difference between sharpening things that are consistent with it and leveling the things that are inconsistent with that specific message. And we see this happens a lot, this sort of sharpening and leveling process. And we're going to see this come up again and again throughout the course, where things float to the top that are consistent with your expectations, and things that aren't consistent kind of fade into the background. And this sort of expectancy effect is really common throughout cognition and psychology more generally. Many times also, instead of things being shaped by our specific expectations, they're also shaped by our general expectations. So things like, well, language is a good one. So language, we aren't even aware really of kind of doing any sort of interpretation whatsoever, right? When you read a sentence, it just kind of emerges what the meaning of that sentence is. But there's all sorts of things like syntax and grammar, obviously spelling, word configurations, sentence structure. These things are all kind of happening, and you're applying them. You're making these interpretations without even knowing that there's anything going on. And there's some really good examples of this as well. In this example by Steve Pinker, our vast experience with language allows us to deal with these noisy conditions and understand this seemingly garbled passage of text. The same goes for our ability to interpret bad handwriting, something that humans find incredibly easy to do. But computer scientists and researchers in machine learning can tell you about the incredible amount of stored information and processing that's required for a computer to understand and interpret something as simple as a handwritten postal code on an envelope. But subjectively, we just open our eyes and apprehend it as humans, because we all have incredible amounts of experience with these sorts of materials that we encounter every day. So we're not even aware of having made an interpretation. I mean, that's what's so cool about this stuff, that when you're listening to Queen backward again, that message, that it's fun to smoke marijuana, that message you can't hear. You can't put yourself back into the shoes of yourself, your previous self, before hearing that message, right? You can't unhear it again. And looking at the Dalmatian dog, you can't unsee the Dalmatian dog. You're forever tainted, right? The bits that are consistent with the dog pop out. The bits that are consistent with it's fun to smoke marijuana pop out. And you fail to recognize, A, that you're even making any sort of interpretation whatsoever, and B, that there are, a squillion other ways that you could have heard or that you could have seen these things. And this is a really important concept. It's so important, we're calling it the fundamental cognitive error. And this is just this idea that we don't recognize that we've made an interpretation and that there are a million other ways that it could have been interpreted.
It's clear that seeing and hearing both involve considerable knowledge about the world.
Yep.
But we can also add memory to that list. So I spoke to an expert in the area, Beth Loftus, and she explained some of the research that she's been working on for decades. And it turns out that memory doesn't work as well as we might expect. So many of us have the intuition that we see and hear and remember everything. Does our mind work like a video camera?
It definitely doesn't work like a video camera or any kind of recording device. We're not just taking in information and replaying it later. The whole process is much more complex, and actually memory is reconstructive. We're taking bits and pieces of experience, sometimes things that happened at different times and places, and constructing our memories.
Recollecting.
When we recall something, the process is more like one of reconstruction.
Okay, so is that a perfect process? Is it fallible? How does it work?
So what happens when you go through life, you have experiences, and you may store bits and pieces of information. But later on, other things can happen. People can talk to you. You can tell people about your experiences.
Yeah.
You can be fed misinformation about the experience. And these activities can change your memory, can transform or distort your memory, so that when you try to call up a memory for a past event, you're reconstructing, and there can be lots of errors.
Okay, but surely if I'm really confident about my belief or my recollection, and it's really sincere and really emotional, surely that means it's more likely to be an accurate memory.
Well, it may be slightly more likely to be an accurate memory if you're really confident about it. But confidence is not a good indicator that your memory is accurate, because false memories can be expressed with a lot of confidence, they can be expressed with a lot of detail, they can be expressed with a lot of emotion, and so they have the same characteristics as true memories. And just relying on those characteristics can mislead people into thinking that something is real when it's not.
Is it possible to implant a false memory, make somebody believe something happened when it never actually happened?
Absolutely, and I mean, in my own work, for example, we've changed people's memories for the details of events that they did experience. We've made people, for example, believe that a car went through a stop sign instead of a yield sign, or a guy running from the scene had curly hair instead of straight hair. That's really easy to do. But you can go further with people. You can plant entirely false memories, whole memories, into the minds of people for things that didn't happen.
Wow. So surely that has implications for people testifying in court, like witnesses saying, yes, that was the guy that committed the crime, or yes, the car went through the stop sign and hit the other car. Does your research have implications for the courtroom?
Well, it does, because most of the time little errors that we make in memory don't matter very much. I mean, it doesn't really matter if I tell you that I had a hamburger for lunch instead of chicken. But when it comes to the legal world, now very precise memory matters. And so memory evidence is precious. It needs to be preserved. It needs to be protected. And unfortunately, a lot of times it's not. And people or circumstances get in there and contaminate those memory traces and lead to travesties of justice.
Wow. Are there any famous cases of false memories?
Oh gosh, well I'm trying to figure out where I would begin with. There's certainly a lot of famous politicians who have had distorted memories, and one of my favorite ones is Hillary Clinton, who was running for the presidency of the United States when she talked about a trip that she had taken to Bosnia, and she had a very vivid recollection of landing under sniper fire on this trip. That there was supposed to be a greeting ceremony, but instead they just had to run to the base. And Oh, later, photographs were revealed of this landing in Bosnia, and it was extremely peaceful. It was lots of children there. Hillary's daughter was there. And so what's going on here? She had a distorted memory, one that resulted in a little bit of embarrassment for her because people called her Pinocchio, but she made a mistake.
Yep.
I mean, she had a false memory. And her case shows us that all that intelligence, all that experience, all that education, all that Yale Law School degree doesn't protect you from having false memories.
You cannot make those mistakes. That's interesting. Do we ever repress memories? So if there's something bad that's happened in our childhood that we might want to forget on some level, do we ever repress memories, and do they ever come back without our knowledge?
Oh, on this whole question of repression, I have to say that what we do is we sometimes don't think about things for a long time and can be reminded of them. Sometimes unpleasant experiences we don't think about for a long time and we can be reminded of them. But that is ordinary forgetting and remembering. This notion of repression, that you can take years of brutalization, banish it into the unconscious, where it's walled off from the rest of mental life, and then get in there and reliably recover it all, just no credible scientific support for this. And yet, many people have been prosecuted or sued civilly based on claims of repression and so-called de-repression.
Is it possible to tell the difference between a true and a false memory?
We haven't had very much luck doing that. I mean, we've tried looking at emotional ratings. Maybe people are more emotional about their true ratings, but that doesn't make a difference. Maybe you see different brain images if you did put people in an fMRI machine, and you'd see differences between true and false memories, but there are barely any differences. I mean, maybe true memories and false memories would persist differentially. Maybe true memories persist longer, but we don't see even evidence for that. My name is Elizabeth. I think about memory.
So what Beth's research really shows is that not just what we see and what we hear, but our memories can actually be distorted. They're plastic and malleable. And there's misinformation everywhere. We're getting a constant flow of this misinformation, so it can be from a stop sign or a yield sign or from other people. So think about how this would work. The media could give you information that might bias you in a particular way and create a false memory or an impression of something. But it's only a false memory because it never happened. It's a real memory. You really experience it, just like you see the Dalmatian dog and you hear those sounds. It's not like this memory is inferior to others. So Beth's work for me really demonstrates that what we remember is shaped by the sum of our experiences. So if memory's not working like a video camera, it's hard to even recognize that you've made an interpretation at all. All of this stuff is coming at you, and it's just like a visual illusion. You remember it vividly, and it's actually happening to you.
So let's use an example to make that a bit more concrete, with a visual illusion. Now this is an illusion that you and I, as well as one of my honors students, discovered a couple years ago. And I think we can use it to really kind of highlight the fact that we really have no control. We're completely unaware of having made an interpretation, and the illusion happens to us in the same way that these memory illusions are just as real as of actual memories. Now we're going to present you with some faces on the screen, and I want you to keep your eyes on the center of the cross in the middle of the screen. So don't look directly at the faces, keep your eyes on the cross. Okay? Are you ready? Here they are. By this point in the video, the faces should look a little bit strange, right? So they might look a little bit alien-like. Some of the eyes might be a little larger than you'd expect, and they might look a little bit paler. But if you replay this section of the video and look at the faces again, you'll see that they're completely normal. We're not playing any tricks on you. There's no photoshopping going on. What's happening is that the previous face is distorting the face that follows it. For example, if one of the faces has small, beady little eyes and it's followed by a face with regular-sized eyes, then these regular-sized eyes look huge. Again, you can't help but to see these faces as distorted. That's kind of the nature of the illusion. There's nothing that you can do about it. You're not even aware that your visual system is doing any sort of comparison. It's just happening to you.
So think about what's happening here. With this visual illusion, when the faces are flashing up and they look alien-like, it's nothing that you're doing, it's just happening to you. And this is across our senses. So yes, it's happening in vision, but it also happens in hearing, and could even be happening in smell and taste. We haven't tested these things, but it's definitely happening in memory. We're unaware that we've made an interpretation, and the sum of our perception is shaped by the sum of our experiences.
So we tend to believe that, with the exception of a few tricks or illusions and so on that might fool us into seeing things a particular way, that the world is essentially as it is. I mean, this is kind of an extension of this idea of the videotape, that we're just kind of going through the world and taking things in. It's being recorded and we can kind of reproduce it faithfully. And obviously, that's not the way the world works. But this idea that the world is like that the world is as it is, and we just interpret it in particular ways, it's called naive realism. And this is a notion that Lee Ross has been working a fair bit on. And he told us a little bit about naive realism and how he sees it working. So here's what he had to say.
Human beings necessarily think that the world is the way they perceive it to be. If I look around this campus, I see walls and windows and grass, and to me, that is the way the world is. Einstein memorably said, reality is an illusion. And what he meant by that is that what we experience in reality is kind of the interaction that occurs between the kind of stardust that we're made of and the kind of stardust that's out there. And that to a physicist, the world is made up of these infinitesimally tiny strings of matter and energy fields, nothing like the way we perceive it to be. That's what we perceive as reality is our way of responding to that input and that construction. Mm-hmm. So, of course, we have to assume that the world is the way we perceive it, and in many ways we perceive the world similarly, and it serves us really well to believe that, this naive belief that there's a one-to-one relationship between the way we perceive things and the way they really are. But it can get us into trouble, particularly when other people come to that world with different histories, different needs, different goals, different biases, different experiences.
That's really cool. The exact same thing came up in my conversation with John Vokey.
The world doesn't really look the way you think it looks. As you know, even what you call solid objects are just made up of molecules with big spaces between them. So it doesn't really look like that. There are no colors in the world.
Okay.
Right? Color is something you bring to the processing of the information you receive. So in some sense, what you just said is always true.
Okay.
You're never really seeing what's out there. So that's one level of explanation. So in fact, hearing things that most other people would argue are not there, or seeing things that other people would argue are not there, is not saying much, okay? Because that's always true.
Okay.
What I think's meant is to try to dissociate, I think what you're asking about, from a straight hallucination, when there actually is no input source that should lead to that conclusion about something being out there, which is usually a result of brain disease or probably induce it with some chemicals as well, where the brain's processing gets quite distorted. And it's actually doing more than just trying to put together a reasonable construction. It actually creates it. whole cloth. So there are people who suffer from various diseases that in fact lead them to really see things that aren't there, in the sense that another person standing right there with them is just, there's nothing there, there's nothing, right? Those are hallucinations though. So what we're talking about in these particular cases where we could lead people to think that they heard, I saw a girl with a weasel in her mouth, something a bit different. We've given enough information, much like we do in the real world. These aren't threshold phenomena that either is or isn't. It's that your perceptual systems are accumulating evidence. And then you can also make use of all sorts of biases that you've developed over your lifetime to at some point say, yeah, I'm confident enough to go with claiming I hear this or see this. And later it turns out, oh, it was just the way the blanket was folded. I thought it was my dog in the bed, but it just turns out it was the blanket was folded. But because I expected my dog there, that's what I saw. So that would be not an hallucination, an illusion of a sense of a type, I guess, is the way to think about it. So that's all we're really doing, and that's just standard, normal processing. So there's nothing unusual happening here. It's just what we're doing all the time. We're not really seeing the world as it is. We're just trying to create something that's reasonably predictive of allowing us to act in the world.
So hopefully people are going to recognize how naive this idea of naive realism actually is. So as Lee Ross and now John have indicated, it doesn't really make sense to talk about things, objectively, as seeing objects and events as they are in the world, instead of being kind of filtered by our own experiences. So it should be clear now to people watching this that, again, seeing, hearing, and remembering all involve considerable knowledge of the world.
Now they set up a table at a market on a busy Saturday morning with 4 pairs of stockings that they labelled A, B, C and D. Now what people didn't realise was that the 4 pairs of stockings were identical.
We think we know what's going on. I mean, it's just, Freud didn't know the half of it. Most of what goes on in our heads we have very little inkling of.
We're just horrible. I mean, it's like we only see the best sort of situation that's gonna get us from point A to point B.
These people aren't any happier than anybody else. The people in the seemingly unfortunate situations are just as happy as the people in the seemingly fortunate situations.
At any given moment, you have things working for you and things working against you. When you take sort of long-term behavior, it's very unlikely that everything's going to work for you or work against you all at once.